Jeremy Corbyn, 251,000.
Poverty isn't inevitable. Things can and they will change.
Dementia tax, gone. Millions losing their winter fuel allowance, gone. Fox hunting ban, gone.
You YouGov poll of this morning, the Conservatives on 48% of the vote, Labour on half that.
We, the media, the pundits, the experts, know nothing.
The biggest campaign growth since polling began.
And in that election, we will commit to unleash the biggest people-powered campaign we've ever seen in this country and in this movement.
I ain't gon' fire on, catch a fade you, I'm wrong, I'm gone. Y'all can catch the wave that I am on, I am icon. Y'all are wide wrong, think that I'm a reconcile born, so ain't nothing to it though. This is on me, ain't got much to do with who you know. Keeping it true to form 10 L's into a milli though. But they already knew that those farewell to your opinions, know that he is.
We achieve all of these things by being a party and a movement totally and absolutely united to our common cause and purpose.
I'ma show you who I am unbreakable. I'ma make you understand. Watch me escape the law. I'ma show you who I am.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where left is best, as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
On this week's program, Camila Escalante of TeleSUR. We're talking about the OAS's assault on hemispheric democracy, election results in Dominica, as well as the ongoing fallout of the coup regime in Bolivia, and Evo Morales's, as well as social movement strategies for fighting back. Chris Nineham, he's author of Warning to the British State. We're talking about the Corbyn Project, the UK elections. We're also going to be making a plea, if you are in the United Kingdom, to vote for Labour. Save yourselves. Help the global left. David Griscom is going to give you a gem. David, what is the gem?
Oh, we're breaking down all the damage that Paul Volcker did in his life.
Nice, because Paul Volcker was not good. In case that's confusing to anybody.
Well, let's not give it away, because one candidate shouted out Paul Volcker upon his death, and
one candidate that I actually think might be more left-wing. Jesus Christ. We are going to be talking in the post-game about Facebook and anti-Islamic politics from Burma to India, China, and the United States. We've got a debunk with Ben Burgess. We're going through every single piece of Hillary Clinton's trash in the Howard Stern interview. Now we're going to check in with Yashka Fisher. What does the centrist European mindset think in 2019 in the age of populism? A throwback with Stuart Hall, and much, much, much more, as there always is. Welcome, everybody. First, we've got to talk about climate, capital, and authoritarianism. The threat of climate change is international. And this is kind of a cliche at this point, but it's not a cliche when it's choking your lungs or flooding your city. And that's happening increasingly across the planet. Sydney, Australia is sort of enveloped with smoke and smog. Hospitals have seen a 25% spike in admissions due to poor breathing conditions in the city of Sydney. The smoke has come from the worst brush fire in the season in the area's history, coupled with a historic drought. And still, the Australian right-wing government, much like our own, refuses to address massive environmental catastrophe and continues to peddle climate denialism. But we need to prepare and fight two battles at once with the climate crisis. The global fascist movement, the authoritarian politics that are still so potent across the globe. Yes, you have your idiot moron versions of Donald Trump, of Jair Bolsonaro, of the regime in Australia that still talk about climate change as a conspiracy, whether or not it's Leonardo DiCaprio setting the Amazon on fire, as Bolsonaro floated recently, or Donald Trump's very persuasive theory that climate change is a Chinese hoax. We know that the next wave that we are going to see, whether or not it's in vigilante terrorism in the United States or more sophisticated populist forces in Europe, is to acknowledge the climate crisis and link it to a xenophobic far-right agenda. And that this politics, as always, will be facilitated, aided, and abetted by the failed neoliberal model that still is the prevailing model of global politics today. Eco-fascists use fear of scarcity to scapegoat immigrants and minorities. They use the rhetoric of environmental catastrophe to advocate for radical action on their own terms. Again, ethnostates, demonizing and targeting minorities and refugees, ecological and otherwise. Marine Le Pen's National Party in France has taken an environmental plank on after years of outright denial. They've done this by making their environmentalism hyper-local and linked to their prevailing xenophobic agenda. The AfD, fascist party in Germany, has taken a green stance. They've talked about better land management and animal rights while still denying the science of climate change, and again, linking climate with their fundamentally xenophobic agenda. It shouldn't be any surprise that its leaders are connected to the right-wing pro-fossil fuel think tanks like the European Institute for Climate and Energy and the U.S. Heartland Institute. Climate change is also being used by the right wing to oppose Chinese and African development. In the U.S., the environmental movement has a complicated past. The Sierra Club used to be virulently anti-immigrant, and many other groups are more interested in preserving country clubs and hunting grounds than opposing pollution globally. Now, we need to have an answer on all of these grounds. People do need community. There does need to be local dimensions of environmentalism. There does need to be a sense of independence and power over one's own lives that is connected with the ecological movement, that truly empowers people, that is antithetical to the far-right agenda and, of course, will never be recognized and facilitated by the neoliberal one. This is the type of work that Bruno Latour in Down to Earth gets to, of literally getting back down to earth out of these imagined globalization and anti-ecological projects. And the nationalist one is the same thing. It's another fantasy. It's another fantasy of retreat and barriers, unlike a fantasy of a globally managed neoliberal earth subsumed by human desires and always taking the back seat. Look at the plans put forward by Emmanuel Macron. His primary initiatives have been to tax middle-class consumption and has, of course, led rightly to the Yellow Vest movement. Look at Mike Bloomberg's authoritarian instincts and anti-poor policies. The Lib Dems in the UK always will prioritize protecting capital over any type of real green transition, as advocated by Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. They oppose Labour's plans to nationalize railways, to radically reduce emissions through public action, and to provide a just transition for workers, which needs to be core and fundamental to any green initiative. Instead, the Lib Dems think that targeted taxes on consumption and a minimal increase in spending will curtail the crisis. Instead of targeting corporations and the system responsible, the Lib Dems expect the poor and working class to pay the cost, just as their corporate democratic friends and Macron in France expect as well. This is a disaster on the merits and the politics of how to address the climate crisis, and like everything else, is the handmaiden of the worst, most dangerous forces in global politics today. The two approaches are both wrong. The Green New Deal is the way forward. Both eco-fascism and capitalist environmentalism function to protect capitalism. Eco-fascism uses the crisis to attack immigrants, fortify borders, but not rein in capital. None of these are fundamentally anti-capitalist projects. Capitalist environmentalism attacks our individual habits instead of major corporations that dominate our entire political and economic process. A Green New Deal or labor's green industrial revolution have the necessary systemic approach to confront the climate and ecological crisis. Climate change is a systems problem, and without addressing that system that you've caused, you're just posturing or making the situation much, much worse. You guys have anything to add?
I think that
let's face it, just that brilliant.
That was incredible.
Smart as hell.
So
rundown
brilliant, so good.
That you're not gonna, frankly, see many other places.
Well, I mean,
all right, let's go to the pitch.
That's the thing, though, is that if we aren't able to win this debate, if we're not able to win this political solution, the right wing is going to be able to use it for very wicked ends. We're going to talk later about what happens when the right wing is able to take control over a crisis. And when you're talking about a crisis like the climate crisis, which is literally an existential life or death crisis for many people, it is a very worrying thing if the left is not able to win this battle, because the right can use this for devastating causes. And we're already seeing it. And it's very frightening, too, to see it start to percolate around like the radical right wingers, the murderers, the thugs who are creating terror around the world. Like, they are citing ecological issues as a major motivation for them to act. And we should be taking it very seriously.
And this is another reason why this ridiculous framing of people need to accept the science is a dead end. I mean, look, of course it's a problem. And of course it needs to be pointed out that major corporations like Exxon and many others have funded systemic propaganda efforts, including inside the science itself, which is another reason why you should not just sort of blindly worship science. They have been able to enlist scientists to minimize the climate crisis, to engage in denialism, to protect their industry, which is a fundamental threat to the human prospect, right? So of course that matters. But that being said, everybody is going to accept facts or science and filter it through their own pre-existing biases and belief systems.
I really wanted to add, though, just on that, is that's a big problem that we've seen with this whole, like, the liberal fetishization of, like, Greta, for example.
Right.
And, I'm not coming after her, but I'm coming after all these liberals who for so long, they think that the only thing to do about climate change is just believe the science. Like, there's not been a radical plan to deal with the amount of damage that we're doing to our globe. It's just been like, oh, well, we believe the science and our opponents don't. That's it. And you're seeing it now where, like, liberals, instead of getting behind plans like the Green New Deal or supporting labor, they're wanting to put up murals of Greta, and celebrating her and turning her into a pop culture figure, which she isn't even asking for, by the way.
No, she's asking for action.
Like, please act. And instead, a lot of liberals for so long have thought that just because they believe in this scientific fact, that's good enough. And they're substituting that for the necessary political action that's going to need to happen.
Right. That's precisely right.
Sort of like our forthcoming conversation on dialectics.
Forthcoming, a think tank episode for patrons coming soon, entitled Machiavelli is really good, though. And he is. The left needs spirituality and Machiavelli. Badly. This is a good time to play the clip. You're right. Tonight's shout out is a little bit different. We're going to talk with Chris Nineham about the UK election soon. But we really just want to urge you in whatever way we can.
Can I play the Can I play the song?
Play what?
The song for the shout out?
Oh yeah, please. Of course.
Shout out, shout out, shout out. My brain is still in recovery mode.
It's such a good
shout out, shout out, shout out. My brain is still in recovery mode. Shout out from taking in so many high level.
I feel like there's a dim-wittedness and posturing that goes lib dem. But of course, he's very, he's a right winger. So there's obviously the Tories. But I could see him getting enlisted to do some type of like Brexit channel for like looking at Nigel Farage telling him he could call him
it
like
really
slurs or whatever.
What it really depends on is if a Lib Dem will sit down with him and come to L.A. or not. Because if
Joe
not, then he's
Swinson had an interview with me.
Exactly. If Joe Swinson came,
if Joe Swinson
talk about
came.
markets.
That would be so awesome if like Dave Rubin does World War II and it was just all like totally contradictory because it was just based on pure. It's like, well, I supported Churchill and Hitler because they both talked to me.
Dave would immediately put it in an American context, be like, yeah, I just feel like the Democrats and Republicans, it's like Labor and Tory. But you guys are trying something different. It's actually the idea.
So you're liberal Democrats, but you're not like liberal Democrats, though, right? Wow, you're blowing my mind.
You should have called yourself the classical liberals.
They're basically the closest party in the world to that dumb description of oneself. Friends don't let friends vote liberal Democrat. Guys, you got to vote for the Labor Party. You have to vote for them. I mean, look, honestly, in our case, our prospects are not bad. Bernie Sanders is surging. And the struggle goes on in any scenario, UK, United States, wherever, because the stakes are so fundamental. But if you guys, after 10 years of being devastated by these governments, reject an option for basic humanity and delivery now, you're locking in. I mean, devastating cuts, privatization, and also a geostrategic future that's delusional. The UK is not going to become the next Dubai or Singapore or anything like that, even if that's what you want. Power is not shifting towards the Atlantic. It's shifting towards the Pacific. And I'm talking now in very capitalist terms. This is not like that's where investment is going. That's where economies are growing. That's where most of the population is. That is where the new geostrategic balance is coming from with China. And so you've already owned gold with Brexit. And you've been destroying your social fabric for 10 years. And you want to do more of that? Gordon Brown was the political partner and fierce rival of Tony Blair. And obviously, I mean, Tony Blair is clearly, just a political figure of the right. But Gordon Brown is somebody who, both for contextual, historical, and ideological reasons, embraced neoliberalism while attempting, and under his reign of Chancellor of the Exchequer, some actual redistribution. I think it's very important to watch what he said on UK television just the other day about the stakes of this election, because he's not only right about the UK, this does have some global ramifications.
Do you look at the Labour Party now and think they're ready for government?
Well, Jeremy Corbyn is a phenomenon. We've got to accept that. He may have disagreed with me on many issues, but I respect...
Certainly did.
Well, he probably voted against me about 500 times.
Did he ever vote with you?
Sometimes. But I respect the fact that he's a phenomenon. And he is expressing people's anger about universal credit, about what happened at Grenfell Towers, about affordable housing, about inequality in our country, about tuition fees. And he is articulating that anger. It's absolutely clear to me that the old neoliberal consensus, which was basically inequality was good for growth and you never have deficit financing because that is building up unacceptable debt, that's all gone. It's completely discredited. It took 10 years from the financial recession for it to be discredited. I couldn't win the argument about a stimulus for the economy in 2010. People were worried about debt and deficits and thought that was the equivalent of incest. I couldn't win the argument with the people, and I regret that, because we then had 7 years of wasted austerity, and this is a lost decade. But now people have come, both internationally and in Britain, to the view that the right form of economic policy is where you can combine social justice, economic efficiency, and environmental sustainability, and there is a new wave of support for what you might call collective action in this country. And
that's it. And by the way, because Boris Johnson and Dominique Cummings are smart, they understand that the sweet spot is some form of social center-right politics and lying. I mean, he says, look, I reject austerity. I'm going to pump a ton of money into schools and NHS. And his numbers have been bullshit. He's talking about future investments that are already allotted for. He's got no answer on the crisis in the NHS because of underinvestment, where you have children sleeping on coats who have pneumonia, when he gets asked about this by a reporter, he blows it off. You guys have a choice. And there's a lot of drama and there's endless smears about Jeremy Corbyn. If you're worried about anti-Semitism and the rise of alt-right forces, that's another reason you need to vote for Labour and vote for the only political factor in this race, namely Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell and Diane Abbott, who have been fighting against racism and fascism and anti-Semitism and xenophobia for decades, while the Tory party has flirted with it and aided it. And honestly, the best case they can summon forward of a ultra sympathetic source to Toryism like Andrew Sullivan is that they've neutralized it by absorbing some of it, right? Like that's their most strategic, devious argument they have for what they've done. And yet all we hear all day is because somebody supports Palestinian human rights that they're anti-Semitic. And that's already being used as a proxy against Bernie Sanders here. So don't fuck around. Vote for the Labour Party.
I mean, especially when you're talking about just such a nasty, horrific, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim party that we're seeing the Conservative Party deform into. It's always been there, but it's very much coming up to the surface. This Labour manifesto is probably one of the more radical and interesting movements in the West politically today.
Totally.
Absolutely transformative. It's going to not only be able to address climate change at the scale that it needs to be addressed, but doing so in a way that's going to bring in so many people who have been left behind in the UK. In a lot of ways, the United States and the UK have very similar trajectories over the past few decades, where massive amounts of financialization have completely decimated the working class in both of these societies, and things that were thought of as just like the normal path of life have been eradicated. There's a lot of young people who don't have a lot of options going forward. There's a lot of worry. And in that kind of moment, you have, the racists and the xenophobes who try to, take advantage of that fear to turn people into right-wingers. Or we have the opportunity on the left, which is always looking forward. We don't live in the past. We say, you know what? We have an opportunity now to rebuild the world, and we're going to do it. And that's exactly what the Labour Party represents. It's absolutely the kind of movement that you're going to want to be a part of going forward. And for the sake of the planet, please do it. Please.
Yeah, for real. All right, we're going to talk about why you should become a patron now. But first, let's start by saying snag your tickets. February 7th, Bell House. We're live with the three of us, obviously. Ilona Minkowski, Pretty Bad Lefty Brandon Sutton, Harvey K, Ben Burgess, and Matt Binder. It's going to be quite a lineup, guys. Snag your tickets. I can assure you they're going fast. We sold out Philly weeks before that show. There was literally a woman, I had a really nice conversation with her in the lobby, waiting to see if there were tickets left. That's a tough position to be in. I think it worked out for her, but just buy your ticket now so you don't worry about it. We continue to grow, obviously, on Patreon, and I want to end this month really strongly. What I'd like is 3,200 by the end of the month as our end month number. So that's super conservative. We should be aiming for 3,300, but this is definitely a slow time of the year. As of showtime, we're at 3,112, and it's time to become a patron today. Next week, we're going to do this a little bit earlier in the show and actually talk a little bit more in depth about the Sunday shows. But I want to kind of highlight something else. Patreon.com/TMBS. And if you're a $21 or above Comrade patron, we do the Skype calls. We just had a two-part series with Joshua Kahn Russell, which was awesome, on organizing. There's so much to learn from him. We're going to be doing more shows together soon, but it's totally a different experience, obviously, doing the group call. And you support these video illicit histories, the next one of which is going to be done in January with Vic Viana about the Rand Corporation. And then we're going to release on the YouTube channel the one that's available for patrons now on Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. These are really exciting. If you're a patron, you get them. We put out one about every 6-7 weeks, every 2 months. These are highly labor intensive. And I want to be really clear. These are like full mini documentaries. They're like very highly produced. And what's awesome is that when you're at that patron level, you get them first, you're part of the process, but also this is like great content to seed in the world. I want to show you an example of one you can already watch with Milton Alamati on the Congo, and on our YouTube channel, there's a full illicit history playlist. So I would say become a patron at $21 above level if you can, and support making these happen. And if you haven't watched them yet, go watch them on YouTube. Let's play this teaser.
Who formed the first, he was one of the Congolese who formed the first national party. He became one of the leaders, and he went to Accra, Ghana, where Nkrumah had convened the All Africa People's Party. So when he came back to the Congo, he had an even heightened sense of nationalism, the role of Africa in the world, and the role of Congo in the world and in Africa. During some protests against the Belgians, 30 people were killed by the Belgian authorities, and they blamed him and locked him up for quote-unquote inciting violence. But they could not suppress the momentum for independence. Early in 1916, the Belgians called a conference in Brussels of all the Congolese parties. But Lumumba's party, which was the only really national party, the others were regional, more ethnic-based, refused to participate. They said, we will not participate unless our leader is released. So they had to release him from prison and flew him to Brussels. And negotiations continued, and the first elections were held in May 1960, and Lumumba's party won the largest margin. So therefore, he formed the first post-colonial government.
Je vous demande de faire de ce 30 juillet 1960 une date illustre que vous garderez ineffaçablement gravée dans vos cœurs, une date dont vous enseignerez avec fierté la signification à vos enfants, pour que ceux-ci, à leur tour, fassent connaître à leurs fils et à leurs petits-fils l'histoire.
So we're incredibly proud of these. When you're a patron at that level, it helps make them happen. Of course, every patron is great, and you get these really in-depth Sunday episodes, and the post games are highly fun. So patreon.com/TMBS. If you haven't watched them yet, watch the Illicit History playlist. And also, I heard that 40% of you who watch these things don't subscribe on YouTube. Just click subscribe and click the bell so you can get all the notifications. We're going to take a brief break. We'll be right back with Camilia Escalante of TeleSUR. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Camilia Escalante. She's a presenter for TeleSUR. Camila, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
It's a great pleasure having you on. Want to talk about a couple of different things in the hemisphere that you guys cover on TeleSUR with a really important perspective. First, there were elections recently in Dominica. Prime Minister Scarrett was able to win re-election in a center-left platform. There was talk before from the opposition of the OAS calling these elections into question, which of course is becoming a really dangerous theme hemispherically. But before we kind of get to that, what just happened in Dominica and what were the stakes of that election?
Okay, so what we saw in Dominica is actually the turnout for the election was that the governing Dominica Labor Party overwhelmingly won the seats that were available. There were 21 seats up for grab, and they won 18 of those seats. But what we saw was a massive red flag along the way, which was the opposition and its national media within Dominica teaming up with international media and the OAS to fabricate these scenes of repression from the ground up in order to show citizens protesting against tyranny, and then also these claims of possible fraud in the election. And like all of that kind of made it seem like this election could have gone both ways, that there was so much opposition to the government. So this government has now been sworn in, or Roosevelt Scarrett, the prime minister, has been sworn in for his 4th term. But the Dominica Labor Party is now on its 5th term. And so the U.S. was really, and the OAS were, really itching to get them out. And but they really made it seem like the situation where over time the government is actually losing support. And that's simply not the case. So yeah, the opposition tried to make a case in the way that we saw, in Bolivia, Nicaragua, and in Venezuela, that it's time for a new government, that in order to cling on to power, they were going to do everything, the government and the electoral authorities would do everything possible to rig these elections. And of course, the outcome is just unbelievably undisputable. All of the sort of roadblocks and violence and the media antics actually worked against them.
What is the record of Roosevelt Scarrett? I mean, I've looked more into what's happening in Dominica, and what's striking to me, and this is just like, I mean, regardless of where this type of interference is happening, obviously Venezuela, Bolivia is unacceptable, but you're not talking about like a particularly radical government at all in Dominica. What is it what does their record look like in power, and what kind of even narrow steps do you have to take to become potentially a target of interference from the U.S. and the OAS?
Right. Well, they do. The government and Roosevelt Scarrett have promoted some social programs that are arguably much more leftist than what we would see from the opposition. Mm-hmm. But, Scarrett did a number of things in this tiny country of about 75,000 people to get on the bad side of Washington. And it does tie back to Venezuela. The CARICOM, the Caribbean community, played an indispensable, principled peacekeeping role in the region since January of this year, when we saw the United States and the Venezuelan opposition attempt to install Juan Guaido in Venezuela. And so more mainstream media focus on the roles of Uruguay and Mexico and even Norway for facilitating talks. But CARICOM and the countries that make up CARICOM, which is St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados, Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, and even Trinidad and Tobago and St. Lucia, very vocally called for dialogue and made calls for non-interference, saying that the Caribbean has to remain a zone of peace. You might have seen these, at the United Nations General Assembly, we saw Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley making this plea as well. And so Venezuela is a Caribbean country and a close neighbor, a next door neighbor of Trinidad and Tobago. And, between January and April in particular, we thought that there would be a high possibility of U.S. military intervention around Venezuela. And those provocations were not just coming from the U.S. main base in Colombia, where the Colombian government is just an extension of the U.S., but the provocation was being staged in the Caribbean Sea. So some of these governments are not even firmly behind President Nicolas Maduro per se all of the time, but they recognize the need to defend their territory's sovereignty from being used for war staging. And of course, this is also a government, the government of Roosevelt Scarrett is also a member of the ALBA TCP bloc. And I think it would be, kind of silly to assume that the United States wants some sort of specific natural resource within all of these Caribbean states. I think Washington is actually just fighting to maintain its hegemony throughout the region. And there are, of course, other reasons to invade Latin American countries besides just lithium and gas. So what they're trying to do here is dismantle the bloc of small countries, which has put themselves at massive risk. This is a massive risk they're taking by standing up and siding with Venezuela in some cases and publicly opposing the unilateral coercive measures, the sanctions on Venezuela and Cuba. And by them doing that, by Roosevelt Scarrett doing that in the UN through CARICOM, it is creating some semblance of balance of power in the region.
Yeah, we played Mia Mottley on this show, and actually we have a good friend and Dave from Jamaica who calls from Jamaica, And he rightly was like, hey, I mean, that was great. But what does that mean when a prime minister or leader from a Caribbean nation state so aggressively, even rhetorically, rejects, U.S. imperial posturing, as, she did, obviously, with the U.S. interference and attempt to dislodge the Maduro government. So that makes a lot of sense in terms of contextualizing Dominica. Now,
absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
And let me see, he's not, he's Roosevelt Scared is not the only one. The most explicit, some people say the most socialist person of another small Caribbean island state is the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Ralph Gonsalves. And he's also spoke very openly, very explicitly against U.S. sanctions. And, he's very openly anti-imperialist and a friend of Venezuela and Cuba. I just saw him at the beginning of November in Cuba and Havana at this international, solidarity conference with Cuba. And he's a very principled man. And what he said is that the United States is doing in Venezuela should be investigated as a possible war crime. And he says that Venezuela is being targeted for ideological reasons, not for any sort of democracy or freedom or peace. The United States is inciting war in plain sight. And, all throughout the world, the media is skewing this reality. And so what St. Vincent did is they actually ran for a non-permanent seat at the UN Security Council. And so the UN Security Council, so that was in June, they actually won that seat, which was pretty major for the Caribbean, and it was celebrated there. And of course, Washington was pushing a seat for Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, who's the new right-wing president. But this year, the United States tried to take Venezuela to the UN Security Council to try to take action. And of course, permanent members China and Russia actually blocked that. But this is allowing St. Vincent to take a seat is actually giving more voice to, some of these smaller states. But actually, it's what it translates to is giving more voice to the region. Because now, now a dissenting voice that goes against Washington is able to stand up against them in the international arena.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just always want to reiterate that really any separate track conversation that people want to have on the complexities of Venezuela and any objections people may have to this or that policy in Venezuelan, in the Venezuelan government is irrelevant in many respects, almost all respects, to this broader objection to U.S. regime change efforts. And also this bigger conversation about autonomy, sovereignty, and actual co-equal partnership in the Caribbean and Latin America with the United States, which is, of course, obviously never been the case. I want to go to Bolivia in the last section of time we have. And I guess we'll just start with what's awful and then maybe some potentially encouraging signs. But can you just talk really distill for us in the last couple of weeks really the nature of this regime? It has been so obscene that even a lot of people who were doing some, foolish liberal posturing in the first weeks after the coup have had to take a step back because apparently a right-wing coup against Evo Morales is not being led by people that are concerned about water pollution. They seem to have some other political motivations at work.
Right. And I think this liberal posturing is really key to what happened here and why the international media played, they played a heavy hand in the coup, because what we have had for years now in Bolivia. So this is what separates Bolivia, I feel, from countries like Cuba, where there is a lot more. Cuba actually has its own English language media. Venezuela has TeleSUR English, also Venezuela Analysis. But Bolivia has actually has not had its own sort of leftist or mass aligned or people aligned media in English or internationally. Even Spanish coverage has been very bad for Bolivia. What we have seen is these sort of NGO people, liberal environmentalists, people trying to, cover Bolivia on the issues of, feminism, their liberal feminism, their fake environmentalism, all while tokenizing indigenous people. So that has been a massive injustice, and the reason why we don't understand the way things actually work on the ground, what organizing looks like, how the mass is actually constructed. So that has been a massive disservice of the international left in not covering Bolivia, and that's why what happened since the coup was parachute journalism, because people didn't understand anything that happens. People had to orient themselves very quickly. So of course we've been covering Bolivia for so long without any sort of class analysis. We've actually been systematically omitting any type of class analysis while trying to throw in these issues of like feminism and everything like that. And so actually the right wing was able to, they were able to use that. And then they're using these issues of like feminism, even violence against women, environmentalism, the fires in Bolivia against Evo Morales. And so that is something, that is our fault, us in the media, the English speaking media. And so, what I spent a lot of time doing when I was there was visiting with the relatives of victims of the two major massacres in two different parts of the country. So the relatives, some victims themselves who survived, and other witnesses, other residents of the area. So one of them was the first one was in Cochabamba, the Department of Cochabamba, and it was near the Cocalero region, I guess. It was, this is a very strong, it's a mass stronghold. It's an area that really supports Evo Morales.
That's the political party of Evo Morales, MAS. Yeah.
Yes, the movement towards socialism is the party of Evo Morales. And so this is a mass stronghold. So following the consolidation of the coup, these people erected roadblocks for kilometers and kilometers. Absolutely everything was completely shut down. Even now, so a lot of the roadblocks, or most of the roadblocks, all of them perhaps, have been lifted, but there's basically no medics, there's no police, there's no fire department, there are no emergency services, because the coup government and the police and military completely abandoned the area because they understand the sort of resistance organizing that's going on there, and they know that it's absolutely not a place for them to be, so they've abandoned their posts. There's completely empty police stations that people can just walk through in that area. So what the first massacre took place there on November 15th, and that 9 people were killed there, and they were killed by the military and by guns. And this is something that the prosecutor and the government and the military and police have denied. They've said that bullets were not found in the bodies. And of course, the ombudsman, what we call the defensoria there, has said that absolutely every single patient that came, or their relatives or whoever found them and grabbed them off the ground, came with bullets. And so this is something that's being disputed. But of course, the Argentine delegation in solidarity with Bolivia, which is all these like intellectuals, social movement people, most notably from the movement Patria Grande, they were there. And they interviewed people just as I did. And of course, their findings in their report said the same, that there were bullets found. And this is just unbelievably indisputable. And people have video evidence, photos. I myself do as well. And so that was the first massacre. The other one took place trying to lift roadblocks around the Sencata gas plant, which is in the city of El Alto, which neighbors La Paz. So that's actually the gas distribution plant which services the city of La Paz and all the rich people in the Zona Sur, all the people who support, Carlos Mesa, which is the second place candidate who, came in second after Evo in the elections, but also some people who support the far right, which is from Santa Cruz, but there are some of those people in the Zona Sur of La Paz as well. So they were at risk of seeing, some major shortages because of these road blockades in these two areas. And then the gas shortage was a huge problem. So, of course, they carried out a military operation.
Oh, did we lose you?
The massacre of 10 people.
We lost you for just a second there, but we got that, which was the second massacre. We only have a little bit of time left, but I want to ask you just 2 different questions at that time. So one You've talked about some of the organic organizing inside Bolivia. What do you make also of Evo Morales? I mean, he's been giving interviews. He's traveling. Obviously, he was granted asylum by the AMLO government in Mexico, which is significant. And he's definitely talking like somebody who's obviously, I mean, he's been deposed by a coup, but he's strategizing. He seems to have a plan. I don't know. I mean, what do you think of the sort of broader viability of resistance to what's happened in Bolivia?
Yeah, absolutely. So when he left, he was at risk of falling off the map. That's always a risk. Or of becoming illegitimate for other reasons. You know, the right wing could have been more successful in saying that he is inciting violence and sedition from the exterior. You know, they were able to round up a lot of, you know, journalists, a lot of analysts, a lot of political leaders, both social leaders from the grassroots on the ground and also political leaders from the elected mass. But, you know, they weren't able to turn it around on him. Actually, what we saw is an outpouring of support internationally when all these people who should have been in solidarity to begin with kind of realized the gravity of what happened. So I think that he's stayed really relevant. I mean, if we're going to speak in terms of social media following, what he's doing on social media is doing very well. Right. These exclusive interviews that he's doing are doing very well. And so I mean, I think a lot of people's like number one question to me has been, when do you think he's going to come back? He's going to return to Bolivia? And I really don't know the answer. And I don't know what strategically would make more sense to do either, because I actually think that the roots, the grassroots, the base of the mass is powerful enough, organized enough to be able to run candidates without Evo in the country, and even without him playing a major role in the election. So I do think I think what he's doing right now is political leadership, and it's very important. And I think it's a really good move to keep himself relevant, to be able to give that massive endorsement to whoever the grassroots decide to promote up to be possible candidates, and whoever ends up being the final candidate. And I think it's really important that he's this person who's kind of like collecting and disseminating information at the top, but not necessarily back in the country yet.
Final question. The linkage through all of this is the OAS, the Organization of American States, which there's a long history here as kind of a proxy of U.S. influence in the region. And clearly this is, I mean, it was an interest of previous administrations, obviously, but there's been a really aggressive take by the Trump administration. And I want to say really counter to a lot of the delusional narratives you hear from some people of taking, you know, Trump's rhetoric that he sometimes will drop about war and this type of thing at face value. You know, particularly hemispherically, they've been very aggressive. But what is this new OAS deployment, I guess, you know, specifically in reference to Bolivia and Dominica, in terms of the OAS versus democracy, the OAS versus the left, the OAS as this sort of new kind of like pre-election call proxy?
Well, I think some Caribbean leaders and probably other social movement people have stated repeatedly that it wasn't always like this. It is that, you know, that Luis Almagro himself is taking more unilateral decisions that are not representative necessarily of this horde of countries that actually usually falls underneath Washington's guard. In this case, he's actually, you know, he's just consulting directly with Marco Rubio and just like, you know, issuing statements which question the decision of governments and saying that this whole sea of countries from the region are also signing on to these positions, which is not necessarily true. But, you know, U.S. intelligence and the OAS are everywhere, and they are, you know, because these two entities are, of course, related and have overlap, but they're prepared to overthrow, you know, any country's government, including the very people they installed, like Juan Guaido. I mean, they've been prepared to get rid of Juan Guaido for many, many months now. And so, you know, they're always looking for an opportunity to, you know, exercise control within a given country. And I don't think, I don't think it's like it's happening all of a sudden. I think it's been happening for a few years now, but they've just been planting in different places. And maybe now because they're sensing a resurgence of the left in the region, and they feel that threat that they have to try to do different situations at the same time. And of course, they're feeling a great deal of threat, again, by Venezuela and the movement of the non-aligned, which are always talking about multilateralism. And the OAS is the enemy of multilateralism in the hemisphere. And they don't want these Caribbean island states or any country to exercise sovereignty over their territory. And so, they're seeing that people are trying to create balance through their respective regions. And they don't want the distribution of power and influence to at any point become more democratic.
If any piece of comedy comes out of all of this, it's definitely the Juan Guaido Periscope coups. They were kind of funny. Results are horrible, but watching him get out there on a live stream, be like, all right, it's time.
Well, it's so awkward. I just am wondering when it's going to end. I mean, I feel like it's already ended. I haven't seen anything he's done in months, but
no, I think they're going to retire him. One could almost feel bad for that guy, except not. Camilia Escalante, presenter for TeleSUR. I really appreciate you joining us and taking us through this stuff. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. All right, folks. We are going to do a gem, and then we're going to talk to Chris Nineham about a warning to the British state and the Corbyn project. But first, David Griscom is going to desecrate the memory of the recently deceased Paul Volcker. We were classy about McCain,
am I good?
Relatively speaking, but I don't think we're going to be classy about Volcker.
No, we definitely need to talk about him because I really want to make sure that people understand exactly what he did and what he was responsible for. I know people on the left, sometimes when they hear people work for the Federal Reserve, they just treat them as bad guys, and that's probably a good first reaction. But it's important to also understand like the role that these people play, and they're very significant in our economy. So, Paul Volcker was put in as a Fed chair by Jimmy Carter, who's also somebody else who we need to have a reckoning with too.
Ooh, music to Harvey K's ears.
No, I mean seriously, he brought in this. He brought in a whole era of destruction, to the American working
and
class.
Austerity, for sure.
And it's coming in, but Volcker was a real driver of that. So when Carter's in power, and Carter brings in Volcker, the United States was at a historic level of inflation. Huge problem. It's also a major change after the end of Bretton Woods, when the United States moved off of the gold standard. So completely different economy, a lot of volatility in the markets, people very freaked out. I mean, gas prices were skyrocketing. So Volcker is supposed to come in and, fix the economy. It's very important to note this too, that Volcker specifically said when Jimmy Carter offered him the job, I want complete independence. And this independence of the Federal Reserve under Volcker becomes a religion that still exists today, where it's an apolitical organization. But whenever we see these apolitical organizations, we should always be worried, because that typically means that they are serving the interests of the ruling class.
Let me just quote our good friend, ideology sniff.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
So here's what happens. So there's a massive inflation crisis, and Volcker comes in and he jacks up the federal funds rate to historic levels, to 17.6%. I'm put up this graphic right here just so people see how significant this was. Yeah, I got it up.
Okay.
So Volcker puts up this massive Fed funds rate, huge. It causes a massive recession a year later, massive unemployment, real calamity for everybody else. And he cuts it again briefly, as you see in this chart, and then he raises it again to 19%, which is just unheard of. It's such a high rate. And essentially what that means is that's the price of money in the economy. And there are two very different functions of capitalists, right? There's industrialists, the people who own the companies that are producing goods, and then there's financiers, there's rentiers who are basically, they want to get interest and they also want to get money back on the rents, on the things that they already own, right? So industrialists want money to be cheap so that they can borrow money cheaply and use that for production. Financiers enjoy to have high profits, and a great way to have that is a high rate of return on your interest. So when he started pushing this, it was very controversial even amongst the capitalist class, but he had a very famous line that he pulled in a bunch of the editors of the Wall Street Journal. And he said to them, when there's blood all over the floor, will you guys still support me?
Oh, sounds nice.
And they said,
sounds very progressive.
and they said yes. So basically what happens when Volcker raises these interest rates to these absurd, high levels is it zaps a lot of money out of the economy. So all of these industrialists, all these people who own companies, what do? They're not going to cut into their profits. So they attack workers, they cut their wages, they fire people, they start to get rid of protections that workers have. Remember, we're coming out of a period of time where the American working class was at one of its strongest, higher union density obviously than today, very militant, lots of strikes. And Volcker basically imposes this, ham-fisted discipline on them by basically throwing a lot of people out of the job because he made the economy so difficult for people for growth, for these industrialists to be able to borrow money. Now, at the same time, this also had a massive effect on the global south and other developing economies because they saw, one, the inflation, and then two, this massive return that they were expected to pay. This higher interest rate was so devastating that Volcker actually got the IMF in. So when we talk about these IMF loans that came into a lot of South America and Latin America, where they said, okay, deregulate your economy, get rid of workers' protections, all this stuff, this was coming out of a crisis that started in the United States that was very much imposed by the Federal Reserve and by Volcker. So, it's very important to remember. So Volcker basically decimated labor by creating an artificial crisis that made it very difficult, made it so that capitalists had an excuse to lay off lots of amounts of workers. And it's still a fear that exists today. People still are afraid of losing their jobs because they remember this crisis that happened in the 80s. And then you go from Carter to Reagan. And this is where you get the deal that basically created the new economy in the United States. And it's very interesting that it also mirrors very similar to what happened in the United Kingdom. That basically, they create this crisis in industry and this boom for finance. So what do you say if you're, an economist or even just like a policymaker? Well, it looks like in the economy, the only functioning and profitable part of our economy is actually finance. So we should really focus on finance and let it become unleashed. So that's when you see all this massive deregulation. That's when you see a complete shift in the American corporation. The corporation becomes financialized. For a long time, financiers and CEOs were a class that were butting heads. Basically, what happens during this period of time under Volcker's reign and then under Reagan is the CEO becomes, an agent of financial capital. So that's when you see their pay packages moving from, just pure compensation to being, tied to the shareholders. That's when you see CEOs moving from being, former workers or people who know the industry well to just MBAs who just know how stocks work and how the market works. I mean, this was a fundamental transition in the American economy and the global economy that was created to combat and defeat labor. And so when we're talking about something like Volcker, we need to remember that this was an agent of chaos imposed by the capitalist class on the working class to completely decimate us. It should be noted that, Volcker was eventually fired by Reagan because he didn't want to deregulate the economy enough. So it's a good reminder.
Well, that's the question I have, because that's going to take us to our person that we still need to clarify, Elizabeth Warren. So the reputation that Paul Volcker has in today's world is of being an advocate during the early Obama administration of relatively, and I use that word relatively, tough financial regulations post-Wall Street meltdown, and of course the infamous Volcker rule. Now, I want you to explain all that in a second, but I just want to read. Can we go ahead to put up this Warren tweet?
Yeah, we should. I got it.
This is Elizabeth Warren tweeted this out. Few people, this is what's really funny, is that the first sentence is totally true. Few people have had more of an impact on our modern financial system than the great Paul Volcker, except for great. For more than 5 decades, he fought for a more robust, efficient, and effective rules to keep the U.S. economy safe. I'm very sorry for his loss. Now, of course, sorry for his loss, sorry for his family. Let's, as always, maintain some decency here. But this is stunning, and I'll throw it right back to you, David, but I just really want to underline, this distills everything that's wrong with the insane framing of her as some type of progressive alternative to Sanders, because it isn't just like, let's freeze frame history to the last 15 years or even the end of the Reagan era, maybe. And you say there's a couple of techno fixes that he advocated that were relatively speaking more liberal than not, although they could still easily be subverted, and the Volcker rule was. But you're including in that several decades all of the war on labor that Volcker waged. So you really are showing, I mean, a lot, the kind of best defense of Warren that she had like on the Breakfast Club was basically, I didn't really think about politics until several decades into my life. But what she is showing, and a lot of people have followed this trajectory, it's a fine trajectory, it's just not my politics. They were Reaganites. Then they got into the Clintons because they wanted what they thought was credibility on markets and the economy, but they were a little bit more socially tolerant. And then through the process of the Bush era and the Wall Street meltdown and the failure of Obama to rein in total financial excess, they have been in the modern context some type of progressive. Now, that's fine, but that is diametrically opposed to somebody who fought all of this stuff tooth and nail for decades. And it also shows a fundamental ideological difference because Bernie Sanders doesn't need to know all of these various tricks and nuances and all this mishigas. He just wants to attack capital on behalf of labor, which is the power understanding that's completely missing from this. Anyways, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a very important point because the thing is, like, when you read just people who are in the financial press or people who just think of the world like neutrally as like, well, not neutrally, but in that sense of like policymakers, right? They're not involved in like the class war or anything like that. Volcker's often talked about as being very brave for what he did. For example, when it came to the inflation crisis. But people like Volcker, their orientation was always going to be toward protecting certain people. And look, the capitalist economy can Volcker could look out for capitalists and also prevent like a massive crisis. So like Volcker's idea basically, like the Volcker rule, was trying to prevent banks from being engaged in the kind of risky trading that they were involved in with funds that were backed up by you and I, right, normal people. What happened with the Volcker rule, and it's not even necessarily like a bad rule, right?
No, it's good.
It makes sense, right? But like the problem with the Volcker rule is that they literally had like Goldman Sachs sitting in the office when they wrote it. And they wrote that rule to be very complicated and confusing. So then under the Trump administration, those same people, literally some of the same lawyers who helped write the rule were like, this law is very confusing. We don't know how it works, right? So we need to get rid of it. So it's just a great example of like how this kind of regulation fantasy really falls apart as long as you still are looking out for that group of people, the capitalists, the financial elite first, right? And I'd also like to add that, Volcker really represents a kind of economic outlook that is so upper class in nature, and that it looks at like the pain and suffering of like the American worker as just like a necessary evil for like the forward progress of this machine that is literally crushing people. So yes, Volcker might have prevented like a larger like inflation crisis. There are other options, other things that he could have done, but to sacrifice the working class versus sacrificing the short-term profits of the capitalist class was never even an equation in his head. And it's something that's very important that we remember, that a lot when we're talking about these organizations, especially like the Federal Reserve, as it has been, because people always get mad at me when I say this, as it has been functioning and has functioned historically, has always been an organization that has been designed to protect the interests of the financial elite. It's never been an organization. Literally, like there was a massive leak a couple years ago that had all of these emails from the Federal Reserve. They pay so much attention to labor negotiations, and they are basically praying that like, the AFL is not going to be able to push up the amount of money that they're getting, because they are worried about higher wages for workers. It's all a part of the balance that they're trying to create. And, sometimes they do things to contract profits in the short term for capitalists, but they always do it in the long-term goal of the capitalist class. And we need to fundamentally change that. And the first thing we need to do is to get rid of this apolitical idea of the Federal Reserve being something above politics, because it's always been used as a way to prevent it having any responsibility for what it's created.
Absolutely. All right, folks, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a brief break, and then Chris Nineham is going to join us to talk about the UK elections, the nature of the British state, Jeremy Corbyn. Then we're going to do a mini illicit history of what's happened in Afghanistan because of these. Basically, the Pentagon Papers of our times have been released, and it is barely noticeable because the longest war we have ever waged gets no attention, and something that implicates the entirety of South Asia. So we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to go to the post game. All right, we're going to take a break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Chris Nineham. He's joining us from the United Kingdom right now. He's author of a new book, The British State, A Warning, which is available from Zero Books, which is also publishing my book, I should say, for full disclosure. He's also an organizer of the anti-war movement in the United Kingdom. Chris, Thank you so much for staying up late and being with us. Appreciate it.
Not at all. It's good to be on the show, Michael.
Chris, earlier in the program, we played a clip of the former Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, saying that the neoliberal model was discredited and that Jeremy Corbyn is a phenomenon. In this relentless onslaught of anti-Corbyn bias in the press across the board, this constant effort of Tony Blair and other right-wing forces in the Labour Party to undermine him, even though Gordon Brown is definitely not as high profile or as popular, but he was kind of the economic brains of New Labour. What is the significance of him specifically acknowledging that?
Yeah, it was an interesting moment. And I think, Gordon Brown, although he was in the Blair government, his instincts were always a bit more what we call old Labour, a tiny bit more kind of redistributional and so forth. And I guess what's really happening here is that, some of the people from, probably a minority actually, but some of the people who were involved in the Blair project are beginning to realise that it was wrong-headed and it was a disaster. And they're definitely, Gordon Brown's definitely right about that. And I guess also there's a wider sense, you can read it in some of the financial papers in Britain, that, even some corporate leaders and so forth are worried about the way neoliberal capitalism is going and how it's losing its legitimacy. And I think the more far-sighted members of the establishment are recognising that there needs to be, at least some kind of a move towards a bit more welfare, a bit of redistribution, and some regulation. I think these are things that are being discussed amongst the sort of liberal side of even the banking community. Not that there's anyone who's actually very keen to really do anything about this.
Yeah, I was going to say, how do you square that with, the New Statesman very publicly and very melodramatically letting them, everybody know that they couldn't endorse this Labour Party? Rory, someone used, I forget now, someone used the example of Martin Wolf, who's the Financial Times columnist, who's longer than most actually been saying we need to get real about the inequality crisis in the financial sector, but he's now having conniptions and catastrophes about labor. What do you make of that contradiction? And then maybe if you could you bridge that with your book, which is really fascinating, because to me, I got more of an understanding than I did before, because Corbyn obviously represents a certain quote unquote radicalism given how far to the right the global economic arrangement has become. But in terms of reality, it's a moderate and, just solid social democratic program. But what I got from your book is that even something as modest as what he's talking about is not only going up against modern neoliberalism, but a really bigger continuity of the British state, the British establishment. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that thesis and connect it with how that manifests in the media bias against him, including the people who on one hand can, wring their hands and get so worried about all these problems, but then the next, oh my God, Jeremy Corbyn, we can't possibly have him. We can't possibly do anything about it.
Yeah, well, these are very deep and important questions. And I think one way to understand it is this, that in the period after the Second World War, when you had in Britain and in many countries in the West and elsewhere, actually, when you had a more statist kind of interventionist kind of economic setup, and there was, obviously part of that was spending more money on welfare and the recognition of the kind of demands of, or at least some of the aspirations, baseline aspirations of the working class. That was at a time when capitalism was, in rude health. It was the long boom. It was a time when, profit margins were relatively healthy. Growth was good. Productivity was increasing in large parts of the Western economies. And so there was a sense in which, the establishment, the ruling class, were happy to bear that. Plus, it was something that was going on around the world, and therefore, was less of a challenge to competitiveness. And even you could argue that there were some reasons why it actually directly benefited the ruling class to have sections of the economy under state control. That whole paradigm obviously started to fall apart in the 1970s. There was the whole turn away from that view. And now you have a situation where, and partly because profitability is still low, productivity in Britain particularly is very, very bad. The margin for, for the ruling class to say, okay, we're prepared to make this sacrifice in inverted commas in order to have a more healthy, happy workforce, it's just not there anymore. And so, the attitude of the ruling class to a kind of reformist project, a kind of, whatever you want to call it, a state capitalist project or a social democratic project, I think is much more kind of oppositional for objective reasons, really to do with the kind of, the health of the system, and also to do with the fact that, it's not happening elsewhere. So, it'd be a particular disaster for, maybe there will be some shift in general towards more statism. I don't think there probably will actually, but maybe there will. But you don't want to be the first, from the capitalist point of view, you don't want to be the first country doing it because you're going to suffer, So I think there's a kind of, there's quite a deep historical difference. And in that sense, what was, as you say, if you look at the manifesto, the Labour Party manifesto, I mean, it's way more radical than anything we've seen in the last 25, 30 years, but it's probably not much. It's probably similar to what was happening in the 70s and early 80s, what was down on paper. But in these circumstances, it's much more challenging. It actually has a more radical content in reality, because it will involve, for it to be carried through, it's going to be carried through in the teeth of establishment opposition. That's the truth. Very, very, very concerted opposition, I believe.
What about this surveillance dimension and national security dimension, quote unquote, of this conversation? The UK is one of the most surveilled countries on earth, if I understand correctly. And there's been this sort of, on one hand, again, starting under New Labour, this fetishization of metrics as sort of like a substitute for like broader strategy and ambition. If we can say, like, I remember there was even some metric, I know Mark Fisher wrote about it, and there's really funny clips of John Prescott, who was this character talking about how, like, we've increased like bird song as a government, which of course we want to protect wildlife, but it was a very funny like metricization of everything. And then on the other hand, the Snowden, you point out the Snowden and WikiLeaks revelations really point out the depth and scale of the UK role in global surveillance systems and spying. And also there's a really good piece that just came out in the Tribune today that I want to shout out by a couple of different co-authors, all of whom I'm friendly with, about the Boris Johnson's support for Jair Bolsonaro and other far-right regimes across Latin America that we talk a lot about on this show. When you couple that with Corbyn being somebody who has also been unafraid to be an internationalist, he was a advocate, very seriously opposed to the invasion of Iraq, as an example. What part does the surveillance state conversation come into play, foreign and domestic, in terms of understanding the election unfolding now?
Well, I mean, at one level, I think it's part of the kind of commodification and the sort of, like you say, having metrics for everything. It's like, it's an index of the extent to which kind of measurement by sort of a profit calculus or a numerical calculus has become dominant right across even in the state. And it's a replacement for, you know, it's a weird kind of prop in a way, because it's a replacement for actually having a state that functions. It just measures instead of functions. It doesn't actually do anything. It kind of unleashes the market and then measures. But for what purpose? Because in the end of the day, these corporations that have taken over whole sections of the state, they don't actually end up getting punished if they don't, you know, there's no kind of kickback if they don't deliver. And so the whole thing is kind of a bit superficial, really. And when it comes to all the cameras and everything, I mean, again, what you feel is this is a kind of an attempt to make up for the fact that police numbers have been cut, and that the whole kind of the sort of state engagement in the everyday life of ordinary people, both positive and negative, is almost being eroded completely. So they just watch us. Whether it actually, I mean, obviously it's sinister and it's frightening. Whether it actually translates into a great deal of effective power on the part of the ruling class is a slightly more open question, really. I mean, I think it's, you know, to me, it's an index of their lack of legitimacy and the kind of mediating institutions that have held British society together, you know, for decades or generations, are really breaking apart. Whether the fact they can watch it is going to be a good kind of replacement for that is I'm dubious about myself.
In terms of Johnson and his strategist Dominique Cummings, that I'd like to hear a little bit more about, are they as savvy as they seem to be?
Been open to massive the Tories, and neither of them are particularly to do with the brains behind the throne. I mean, one of them is that the main one is that they have got lucky with the whole Brexit, which was a kind of weird accident that it happened at all. And, you know, it has played well because it's become, the Brexit question has become very, very divisive in both Labour and actually in the Tories, but crucially in this instance, in Labour, or in the sort of broadly progressive left. And in particular, Brexit became a kind of lightning rod for people's discontent against the wider status quo. And by the Tories, by being pro-Brexit, they've actually managed to, and by pushing, or by Labour allowing itself to be pushed into a more and more openly Remain position, it's kind of created a culture war that can be exploited. And that's really the main problem with this election. The other thing that's worth saying, by the way, is that, and this is probably no surprise to your listeners, but it needs to be said because it's so blatant, is the extent to which the media terrain is so loaded against the left. I mean, there's only one mass circulation or the mainstream media outlet in Britain that is pro-Labour, which is the Daily Mirror. Out of all of the outlets, they're all basically hostile. And even the Daily Mirror is not very friendly to Jeremy Corbyn. So there isn't, you know, there's no one in the mainstream batting for him in those, and that's going to have an impact. So I'm not so sure it's about, you know, Cummings being this brilliant strategist, really. I think it's that the Tories, I mean, and Boris is such an idiot, you know. I mean, he's clearly exposed himself as being, you know, a kind of very poor operator. There was all this talk about him being a great communicator. Well, that's obviously not true because they've just tried to kept him locked up in a box throughout the whole campaign because they know he's not. So I think it's more the kind of wider context. And if it wasn't for this wider context, I think genuinely that, you know, it would be very much easier for Jeremy Corbyn to have won probably a majority in reality.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously there's a just stunning media warfare against Corbyn, and I've definitely covered that on every outlet that I have. And as part of that warfare, I do want you, I mean, it seems like so much of what's happening in today's politics is that there is a resurgence in interest in, let's just broadly say, socialism, I think because of objective material conditions and facts. and there's a openness to a much broader set of ideas and really class-based analysis in a way that is particularly noticeable in the United States. And then on the other hand, we run into these scenarios where it does seem like, and this is very bad, maybe you'll give us some hope in a few minutes, that there still are these just sort of simple culture war elections. And when I say culture war, I don't mean issues at stake, whether we're talking about equity for people, the rights of refugees, fighting racism and so on. I'm talking about culture war elections, which is I am programming different content to different audiences and I am brand identifying different things. I like Brexit, so I hate sushi. I loathe Brexit and I want sushi. This type of sort of, very much kind of like what TV programs you're watching, extension of politics, which erases the class and structural dimensions to it. And it seems like Brexit and the UK have been totally subsumed in that. And that's where people like Tony Blair want, it's not left versus right, it's open versus closed. And I get that we can all analytically reject that, but it still seems to have a salience for a lot of people, particularly when the media is forwarding that narrative.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, it's a little bit complicated because in a way, I would argue that the left hasn't played its cards particularly well on Brexit because, the analysis of why the majority of people who voted to leave was always going to be a very crucial question. And I think whole sections of the left and the sort of, the liberal left actually got it wrong and read it simply as a reactionary vote. Without understanding the contradictions of it, the fact that there was a very strong element of it being a rejection of the kind of Westminster elite, and also it contained within it an element of rationality, in my opinion, which is that, people felt the EU is completely undemocratic and that actually the only democratic institutions we do have, however weak and feeble, they are based on, the national state and parliament and so forth, and that's actually a higher level of democracy than exists in the EU, which I think is personally demonstrably true. So I think there has been a problem with the way the left has played it, which has allowed it to become something that can be instrumentalized against them too much. And I think Corbyn has tried his best to, in a hostile world, in a hostile context of the Parliamentary Labour Party, and even lots of Labour members who I don't think, necessarily took didn't quite grasp it in the way that I would have done. So I think there's an element to it. I think, and on top of that, I think the other element that really has to be understood here is that relates very, very sort of, it regenerates an already existing sense of betrayal, deep, deep, deep sense of betrayal by all politicians in Britain, which obviously is to do with, particularly in Britain, is to do with the whole Blairite experience and the Iraq War, but also just the way in which Blair, turned the Labour Party completely into a pro-market operation. And again, that's completely rational. How can you blame people for that? And then when you have on top, for a lot of us know on the left that Corbyn stands for something different. He stands actually for a break from that kind of, free market consensus and the lying, cynical politics. But, not necessarily that message hasn't necessarily got out to the wider world. And Brexit has helped to stop it getting out to the wider world. Because the truth is, Labour's position is, it's changed from being one, we will recognise the result of the referendum and go for a people's Brexit, to really, we won't recognise the first vote and we're going to have another referendum. And that has created a sense of betrayal around lots of people. So it kind of is a culture war, but in a way, I think the left has allowed it to become that. Could have played could have played our hand much more strongly, in my opinion.
That's interesting. that's I'm going to take that in. That's definitely different than what you hear from literally everybody. Which has a good, but that's advent. Yeah. It's always struck me that they've never, I mean, it seems policy-wise pretty, that Brexit's definitely a bad call, but people have never had an answer anytime I've ever said, okay, there is a leave vote in Labour. What do you do about that? That's always glossed over. And I've never heard an answer to that from anybody who's, advocated that they need to reverse position. In the final section, Chris, instead of asking you to make a prediction, although obviously if you have any optimism that isn't reflected in the polls, that would be great. Can you paint a couple of scenarios for us post-election for a Corbyn project? So there's the worst case scenario. There's a Tory majority, they dominate. Maybe there's a much closer election, but still, basically putting the Lib Dems in position to go in and, I think almost certainly team up with the Tories. People say they won't do that. I don't believe that. I think they certainly would. Or, maybe attempt to instigate some type of like Blairite coup inside Labour as a precondition for some type of neoliberal coalition. Or let's say Labour really shockingly overperforms. We would still be in some type of coalition situation. But, I mean, obviously that's the most optimistic scenario. But the day after, what are the kind of 3 courses you can imagine charting to continue this fight?
Well, I mean, I am, I do think the polls underestimate the Labour vote. I think that's almost inevitable given who they are, and there is a long record of that. So, personally, I think there probably will be a hung parliament. I mean, it's crazy to make predictions because it's such an uncertain situation. But if I had to, I would say that. There's obviously lots of different versions of a hung parliament. But yeah, let's go through the scenarios. Labour does very, very well. Obviously, that would be everyone's favourite outcome. I think even then, as I argue in the book, I think what we have to understand that, if Labour got in, say with a kind of support from the SNP, which is probably the best outcome we can expect at the moment, then even then there'd be all sorts of manoeuvres against Corbyn. I mean, I think that's dead cert. I think the people we've just had the thing today, John Ashworth, I don't know if you've heard about it, but he's the Shadow Minister for the Health. There's a recording circulating that he had a conversation with a Tory where he was basically saying, that the Labour right are just biding their time. They want to move against Corbyn. This stuff is going to happen.
Right.
So that's one scenario. The other scenario is, some sort of more chaotic situation with possible. I'm actually very sceptical about a Lib Dem Tory alliance myself, because I just don't know how they deal with the Brexit question on either side, really, because they're so at loggerheads on that. But I mean, you're right, you can't rule it out. That, on the other hand, would be an extremely difficult situation, and this is an element that we've got to understand here. The situation is difficult for the left, but it's very, very difficult for the right. I mean, there's all sorts of problems. And partly the fundamental problem they've got is the British ruling class is pro-EU. They have a very, very crazy, incompetent leader of the leader of the Tory party who is, has decided to become a big Brexiteer. So the main party of the British ruling class, one of the most successful capitalist parties in the whole world, is pursuing a policy on one of the key questions of the day, directly in contradiction to that of its economic masters. That is a fundamental problem that British capitalism is going to have to face, and it's not pretty. Plus, Boris is an extremely divisive and polarising character. So if he does get into number 10, there's going to be especially if it's with some weird alliance with the Lib Dems, it's going to be political pandemonium, that's the truth. Obviously the whole of the left will be very, very demoralised and depressed, and there'll be the whole massive debate going on about that. But I think and if the Tories do well as well, that will be devastating. But even then, I don't see it being a period of social calm. I just don't. Right. The forces that have given rise to Corbyn I mean, Corbynism isn't an accident. People talk about, the changing of the election rules, the internal Labour Party leadership election rules, and that was important. But fundamentally, it wasn't an accident. It was an expression of a mass popular rejection of Blairism, basically, on the left. It was an expression of a sense that things have got to change, that neoliberalism is just not working, that it's causing misery, it's dysfunctional. Everything in Britain is dysfunctional. The railways, the hospitals, the social services. We're in a society which is people experience as being very hostile and very and very kind of falling apart essentially. And in those circumstances, this is where Corbynism comes from. And I think one of the things you've got to take on away from the election is that there's been a huge engagement by activists in it. I mean, the canvassing has been phenomenal. I think it's probably been the biggest, election operation there's been, really, in terms of the activism. And that tells me something about the left, which is that there is actually a very big, very vibrant, and actually quite active left in Britain, which you couldn't have said, you wouldn't really have said, a decade ago or a couple of decades ago in a way. And that's very important. And, that left, although it will be, I think people may be surprised by the election result in a good way, but if the result is bad, that left isn't going to go away. People will get very demoralised and there'll be a lot of soul searching. But I do think that left will have to, reconsider its positions. It's impossible to predict exactly what that will mean. But one thing I think it should mean is that we need to seriously rebuild the kind of extra parliamentary left. Because in any of these scenarios, whether it's the Tories doing well or Jeremy doing much better than expected, even in that scenario, there's going to be huge attacks from the establishment. There's going to be questions and challenges that can't be answered in Parliament, and or simply by parliamentary action. And we need to be in a position where people can come out onto the streets and we can have a participatory mass movement or series of interlinked mass movements, working with the unions that have a penetration into the workplaces, that that can actually start to make a difference in this situation. Because I'm a big Corbyn fan and I'm a fan of Corbynism, but in a way, one of the potential downsides of what's happened is that lots of people who have been spent a number of years organising in their workplaces or in their streets have been totally taken up in the parliamentary process or the process of parliamentary politics. And I think that's not sufficient, and it won't be sufficient to deal with any of the scenarios that are potentially coming out of this election.
Right. This is exactly the same scenario that happens in the United States, by the way, from the best case scenario of a Sanders presidency to the atrocity, of a second Trump term to just the kind of middling garbage of another Democrat. There has to be these outside forces that isn't just, and it's funny because it's kind of a left cliche, which is why I think in some ways you got to, resist it at times, like, oh, well, people just need to be out organizing more. But at the same time, people need to be out organizing more in any scenario.
But the weird thing is that it's a left cliche that is now a very minority voice on the left, in the sense that, in the sense that that people are really taken up with the whole electoral thing, which is absolutely fine. And I've been out canvassing, and that's exactly what the left needs to be doing at this moment. But the argument, which, as you say, should be a cliche, should be sort of standard, which is that whatever happens in Parliament, the unions need to be strong, the social movements need to be strong, because we will have to get out there to force the right back, or to support the left in Parliament, or to take on a new Tory government. That argument isn't really being put anywhere. And one of the things I think, if you look at the last 20 years of the left in Europe and in America, is that I can discern a certain pattern, which is that you get these big social movement moments or periods when there's massive, anti-war or anti-austerity mobilizations and sometimes big strikes and so forth, they then in certain circumstances lead to the creation of new parliamentary or electoral left projects. And when they're quite successful, suddenly everyone forgets about the street. I mean, that's what happened in Italy in the mid part of last decade with Rifondazione. It's what happened most obviously with Syriza in Greece. And I think we've got to be a bit more sophisticated than that. And we've got to not get into a cycle of kind of mass movements, parliamentary expression, disappointment, back to the mass movements. I think we need to have a kind of, dare I say it, a bit more of a dialectical approach to this and think, yes, the electoral element of a left strategy, the kind of parliamentary electoral element of a left strategy is important, is crucial, but it's never the most important thing, actually. Or maybe it is for a few weeks, but in terms of a slightly broader timescale, it always has to be connected to something that is going on in the communities. And this even applies to the question of the vote, to be honest, because if there was a sort of more active engagement of the wider mass movements and the unions in the election, and not just knocking on doors, but actually organising protests and street meetings and so on and so forth, then we'd be in a better place with the election. Right. So I'm just, this is one of the arguments of my book, I was against the kind of the flipping from one to the other and against the idea that politics is mainly what happens in Parliament.
Chris Nineham, the book is The British State, A Warning. It's an excellent book. It's published by my publisher, Zero Books. If you are in the UK, Jesus Christ, go out and vote for the Labour Party. Chris, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate your time.
Been nice talking, Michael. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. All right, folks. We do so much on the show. We really do. Actually, I think, and honestly, it's a really good book, and I would check out all of Chris's videos on the Zero Books channel, which everybody should be subscribing to if they haven't already. All of Doug's stuff's really insightful. There was just a major piece of reporting in the Washington Post, and I'm going to take a little bit of time. We would normally do this in a post game, but I'll do this in the main show. Basically documenting that throughout the entire Bush, Obama, and Trump eras, there has been systemic lying and disinformation on the part of the U.S. government and different administrations on what exactly is happening in Afghanistan. Multiple shifting rationales for why we're there, constant efforts to spin and formulate successes that are not existing. And basically, you have a war now that's longer than Vietnam. I believe Afghanistan is the longest ongoing war in U.S. history that has consumed an incredible amount of lives. U.S. soldiers, endless Afghani civilians, where you are in a situation where basically the Ashraf Ghani government controls about half of the country. The rest is by various factions of the Taliban. This has deepened and created all sorts of new problems in terms of the U.S. and Pakistani relationship. It has been a boon in some respects for the Pakistani intelligence services, ISI, who play a double game with the CIA and the Taliban. Everybody should read Steve Call's Directorate S book. It's also had an enormously damaging effect on Central Asia and on Pakistan. The war, of course, has been conducted most aggressively under Obama with the drone program in Pakistan that killed a significant amount of Pakistani civilians and caused a new layer of instability there. We don't know the exact amount of civilians because the drone program civilian casualty rates have never been properly measured, but we do know that all civilian casualty rates are skyrocketing under Trump. I'm going to quote a little bit from Juan Cole, who wrote a great piece. We didn't need documents. America's $1 trillion failure in the Afghanistan war has been obvious all along. Basically, a lot of reporting of Whitlock's articles focused on U.S. government lies and misrepresentations about so-called progress on the war front. But this was all along obvious to anyone who knows anything serious about Afghanistan and Pakistan. Our Madison Avenue advertising culture gives the U.S. government the tools to pull the wools over people's heads. Government spokesmen in the forever wars have just two categories: progress and slow progress. In a epochal disaster like losing a whole province is slower progress than we would like. And he goes on to just talk about the various massive blunders here. Let's go through a little bit of of history here. This is George W. Bush. Remember, after September 11th, this goes back to the 1980s. This goes, all of these relationships were formed during the U.S., Saudi, and Pakistani support of the Mujahideen fight against the Soviet Union. Then Afghanistan is abandoned. It's multi-warlord factions. The Taliban rise in the mid-90s, and initially there's actually some really positive overtures with the United States because there's pipeline deals to be had. Osama bin Laden is there. They're hosting him in Al-Qaeda, and he's got a huge amount of money to dispense, and still almost certainly different links to various parts of the Saudis. So this is George W. Bush after September 11th. There's, of course, not going to be any strategic response. There's not going to be any humane response. There's going to be a massive bombing and onslaught against Afghanistan. And really importantly, this whole war on terrorism framework, even though we don't use that language anymore, is still 20 years later how we conduct all of our global military policy. This is still the framework upon AUMF, which has never been reformed. There was just a massive military spending bill that, of course, the Democrats totally rolled on, that given to all Saudi demands on their genocide in Yemen, that would allow the Trump administration to use AUMF money and authority to attack Iran, and does nothing to hold any of this back. This is George W. Bush launching it back after the September 11th attacks, several weeks after.
Good afternoon. On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime.
Now, this went on for multiple years, and after initially sort of claiming success by essentially putting the Northern Alliance into power, dispersing the Taliban and al-Qaeda, and again, a huge amount of civilian casualties, loss of U.S. life, Afghanistan just kept going and going, and it was not successful. In fact, it was destabilizing Pakistan. There was all sorts of, not all sorts of reporting. It was still pretty underreported then of problems in the Karzai government. Then Barack Obama comes along, and he's not an anti-war candidate. He's an anti-dumb war candidate. So the invasion of Iraq is dumb and not intelligent, not a war crime. And we need to focus on the smart war in Afghanistan, which is pretty clear to anybody very early on with any historical awareness is unwinnable. But Obama still makes a Machiavellian calculation to surge troops in Afghanistan under military pressure and with political calculation.
This review is now complete. And as Commander-in-Chief, I have determined that it is in our vital national interest to send an additional 30,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan. After 18 months, our troops will begin to come home. These are the resources that we need to seize the initiative while building the Afghan capacity that can allow for a responsible transition of our forces out of Afghanistan. I do not make this decision lightly. I opposed the war in Iraq precisely because I believe that we must exercise restraint in the use of military force and always consider the long-term consequences of our actions. We have been at war now for 8 years, at enormous cost in lives and resources. Years of debate over Iraq and terrorism have left our unity on national security issues in tatters and created a highly polarized and partisan backdrop for this effort. And having just experienced the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, the American people are understandably focused on rebuilding our economy and putting people to work here at home.
Now, Obama would actually make a very odd play, which is he would promise to pull those troops out after 18 months of going in. And then you heard a lot in this time period with General McChrystal and General Petraeus, basically about replicating what they did in Iraq, which was sold as a surge that was effective. But really what it was going to Sunni leadership across the country and saying, look, we're going to protect some of your rights economically and otherwise, and here are bags of cash, which was much more persuasive than the surge, but not replicatable in Afghanistan for a variety of reasons, including a huge amount of broader just sort of political illiteracy about, even just as an example, the different ethnic factions inside the Afghan context. It continues on. We're rolling right through, including, of course, an accelerated drone warfare and the relationship with Pakistan. And then this guy became president.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. 52 compared to thousands, and we're doing a tremendous job. And as you know, a big part of that job is ISIS, certainly the biggest, and Al-Qaeda, and we've got them down very low numbers. We'll have that totally taken care of in a very short period of time, and we'll see what happens. The Taliban wants to make a deal. We'll see if they want to make a deal. It's got to be a real deal, but we'll see. But they want to make a deal. And they only want to make a deal because you're doing a great job. That's the only reason they want to make a deal. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank the Afghan soldiers for really, I've spoken to a lot of you today, and you say they're really fighting hard. I was very impressed with that, actually. So I want to thank you.
So that's Donald Trump, who, of course, in the first couple of months in his administration, authorized an operation that killed multiple civilians right out of the gate when he became president, and then also dropped a massive payload bomb in Afghanistan in 2017. That was just
mother of all bombs.
Mother of all bombs.
That's only because they don't have a father of all bombs.
Right. And then Lindsey Graham, the ultra hawk, has been saying, according to Indian media reports, that this could all end if the Pakistanis would just stop supporting the Taliban, which is basically like saying, like, yes, this could all end if we had immediate world peace, or if the United States stopped supporting the intelligence services in Pakistan that support the Taliban. These things are slightly complicated, unfortunately, and there's a nexus of relationships that don't work for anybody. 3 months ago, negotiations with the Taliban were canceled, and they are resuming again as of yesterday. Talks between the United States and the Taliban resumed this weekend, 3 weeks after President Donald Trump abruptly canceled negotiations aimed at ending America's longest war. News of the talks came just before the Washington Post obtained a report of more than 2,000 pages of government documents that they say it shows how U.S. officials for years have misled the public about the war in Afghanistan. And NBC News has contacted the White House, State Department, and Pentagon for comment, and the U.S. Taliban talks have restarted in the Qatari capital of Doha on Saturday with the goal of reducing violence and the laying groundwork of the peace talks between the Taliban and Afghan government, a State Department spokesperson told NBC News. Now, could you have, going back to 2001, have isolated more extreme versions of the Taliban and gotten them to give up Osama bin Laden? Definitely, possibly. Could you have done surgical and precise operations against a discrete security threat instead of a massive global war regime that has cost millions of people's lives and wasted a huge amount of money and had a global rise in surveillance? Yes, you could have. And this all goes back to the ahistoricity, and if that's even a word, and insane warmongering that happened after the terrorist attacks of September 11th. And we're still there. Like, it's like background noise. Like, oh yeah, we just killed a wedding party. So that's Afghanistan.
Whoops.
Now, there's a lot of talk about impeachment. And there's a lot of, I think we've charted the course that's obvious, which is that Donald Trump has committed multiple crimes. The whole point of a political project is to damage him, ideally. I think the verdict remains open, though I think that it's going to be a wash, not a disaster, and potentially positive if it plays out correctly. If this was something on Trump's concentration camps or simple financial corruption, yes, I do think it would be significantly more compelling, both morally, strategically, and politically. Do all of the sets of policies around Ukraine that people uncritically repeat verbatim without any understanding of them beyond as a cudgel of attacking Trump, is that problematic? Without a doubt. Is there a broader national security conversation that needs to be had? Of course. But that's not what the Trump administration is doing. And this is another interesting contradiction on the left. For all of the dumb liberals that have no systemic understanding of U.S. foreign policy and nothing beyond Trump, which we already know is a fundamental problem that we have to deal with, there's some people on the left who take, I think, what Trump says at face value. The reality is that in most areas, he's amplifying U.S. empire. Now, it's a dying empire. It's a retreating empire because of other power dynamic shifts that any president would have to deal with. But in the main, there's massive kinetic activity across the globe. There's aggressive regime change efforts across the hemisphere. There's an untold amount of civilian casualties. And in the main, he's even actually opposed, in reality, an aggressive policy in Eastern Europe and in Russia, even as he's trashed NATO. So we can't retreat back to the previous consensus, which was unjust and dangerous. But we also can't, we need to take advantage of the chaos that he's created while also recognizing that in the main, he's just an extreme version of what already existed. That's Abby Martin's whole point. She's 100% right. And we need to use impeachment effectively against him. And this clip of Nancy Pelosi does reveal so many of the American elite's priorities and the fact that Iraqi lives don't mean a fucking thing to any of these people. This is Nancy Pelosi getting asked about impeaching George W. Bush.
So, Speaker Pelosi, you resisted calls for the impeachment of President Bush in 2006 and President Trump following the Mueller report earlier this year. This time is different. Why did you oppose impeachment in the past? And what is your obligation to protect our democracy from the actions of our president now?
Thank you. Thank you for bringing up the question about, because when I became Speaker the first time, there was overwhelming call for me to impeach President Bush on the strength of the war in Iraq, which I vehemently opposed. And again, I said at other places, that was my wheelhouse. I was intelligence. I was the ranking member on the Intelligence Committee, even before I became part of the leadership of Gang of Four. So I knew there were no nuclear weapons in Iraq. It just wasn't there. They had to show us, they had to show the Gang of Four all the intelligence they had. The intelligence did not show that that was the case. So I knew it was a misrepresentation to the public. But having said that, it was in my view, not a ground for impeachment. They won the election, they made a representation, and to this day, people think that it was the right thing to do. If people think that Iraq had something to do with 9/11, I mean, it's appalling what they did. But I did, and I said, if somebody wants to make a case, you bring it forward. But they had impeached.
That was the case. Well, I mean, literally, what could be a more relevant thing to impeach somebody for than lying about intelligence to invade a country?
I like how she says they won an election and then made a representation.
They sure did.
Yeah. That's some Washington speak for you.
I mean, that's mind-blowing. And that is that great David Feldman joke. She didn't want to impeach Trump either. And Feldman said, when they implicated the ability of the children of Democratic Party elites to make money on lobbying, they crossed the Rubicon. Nancy Pelosi recognized that. So that's disgusting, and it's very revealing of a mindset. Guys, become a patron today, patreon.com/TMBS. See us at the Bell House February 7th. I want to thank everybody that makes this show possible. We have a ton to get to in the post game. So let's go do just that. Thanks, everybody.